record on this computer. Okay, so we started recording, so let me share the screen. Okay, let me do it like this. Excuse me. So I was thinking, I mean, what could I possibly, tell people about the conflict? And I'm sure you follow the news and you already know a lot, and you're intellectual, so you tend to think deeper and analyze things. So there is no much I can tell you about what's going on right now in terms of actual development of the events, because you already learned that from news. But I thought what my contribution could be is just to put it in the historical context so that you better realize what are the root causes of the conflict. And also just to tell you what Ukrainians are thinking right now, how life in Ukraine is. So basically, it's just a brief history of Ukraine and its conflict with Russia, and also some overview of what's going on right now and what are the possible solutions, at least from what I hear in Ukraine and from other sources. So just a background. You all know me. I'm from Ukraine, of course, but I never told you exactly where my parents are, where my other relatives are, because it was not that important. But I think right now it is important to know, because it just puts it in a perspective of how crazy this whole thing is for me and for my family. So my mother is Ukrainian, who was born in Ukraine. My father is Jewish, who was born in Belarus. And they met in Russia, in Siberia, when they actually went to school, where they went to medical school. So they met in Siberia, in Novosibirsk, where they attended the medical institute in Russia. That's how they call medical schools. And then they worked for a while. They practiced medicine in Russia. And then they came back and settled in Ukraine. And they lived all their life in Ukraine. So Ukrainian and Jewish from Belarus. And then currently, my uncle, my father's brother, lives in Russia. And my aunt, his sister, lives in Belarus. And they still talk to each other, obviously, on FaceTime and everything. So it just demonstrates how interrelated people are in this area and how crazy this whole conflict is. It's just so bizarre, because when I was a kid, I visited Belarus every year. I also visited Russia probably every other year. I would visit my uncle and my cousins, and right now we are just on different sides of the conflict, which just doesn't make any sense. So for me, it's kind of painful. We still have to talk to the relatives, but everybody has their own view of this. So anyway, now in terms of history, so let me just see here. Oops. Hold on a second. For some reason, it doesn't keep going. Okay, let me just click these arrows. Okay, that's how it works. Okay, so now let me just overview the history of Ukraine briefly, so that you realize where it all is coming from. So turns out that Kiev, which is the capital of Ukraine, was also the cradle of the modern Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. So they say that Kiev is the mother of Rus cities. So-called Kievan Rus, or in Russian Kievskaya Rus, state was established somewhere around early thousands, which is pretty much 11th century. And at that time, Kiev was the capital of the state. And, Kiev, Minsk, Moscow, these three cities were all part of the same state, again, with the capital in Kiev. So from that perspective, Kiev was created way before Moscow, and Moscow was just a small, tiny village when Kiev was already a major city. Then, sometimes in the 13th century, the Kievan Rus was conquered by Mongols, and that's just started the beginning of the breakup of the Kievan Rus state. And then, the Mongol occupation lasted for 300 years, very long. And of course, it degraded the economy, it slowed the innovation, It really, affected the education level. So it pretty much, stressed out the state. And no wonder when Mongols eventually left, the Kievan state pretty much broke up in pieces. And at that point, Kiev was absorbed by Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which at that time was a major power. But the rest of the Kievan state went to, created its own country, which was called Russia at that time, with the center in Moscow. So at that point, they just went separate ways. But of course, the ethnical connection between Ukrainian and Russians always existed, because basically at that time, they all came from the same roots. So after being under Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth for a while, Ukraine decided to join Russia again by signing the treaty with Russia's Tsar, asking for protectionism. So basically, Russia took Ukraine back in 1654. It was rebellion. It was rebels in Ukraine who were fighting Polish and Lithuanian Commonwealth. And when they signed the treaty, they became part of Russian Empire. So that was 17th century, 1654 to be exact. And that was the moment when Ukraine was hoping that they could live together with Russia peacefully, while also maintaining their own Ukrainian identity, language, culture, just like any other minorities live within bigger states. Unfortunately, it didn't work out, because when in 19th century, Ukrainian identity emerged and became closely linked to region's Cossack heritage, their own language, their own poetry, their books, culture, and so on, Russians didn't like it. Not sure why, because Russian Empire at that time had a lot of smaller territories with their own identities, and seemed like Russia didn't mind that. But for some reason, when it came to Ukraine, they saw it as a threat. Maybe it's because Ukraine was the biggest part of Russian Empire, and if you have a significant, national identity on such a big piece of land, especially prosperous land, because Ukraine was always very fertile land, educated people, high human capital, and so on. So maybe they saw it as a threat of separatism, and they were concerned that if Ukraine breaks away, then somehow the whole Russian Empire might actually fall apart. So they view Ukrainians as little Russians. There is a name, Malorossia, in Russian, but in English it is translated as Little Russia, or Ukrainians as Little Russians. They never recognized Ukrainian national identity. So to fight that rise in Ukrainian identity, they started banning teaching Ukrainian language in schools, publications of books in Ukrainian, delivering any lectures in Ukrainian, fearing that it might actually create undesirable consequences for Russian Empire. So that was a pretty significant full press trying to pretty much destroy the development of Ukrainian identity. So already Ukrainians were not happy in the union with Russia. So they were looking for the ways to separate. And then the revolution came in 1917, the Russian Revolution, the communist revolution, and Ukraine saw it as an opportunity to become independent. And they did. They did become independent very briefly, but unfortunately, it didn't work out because, again, there were fights. So initially, when Russia was weak, right, during the revolution, it was also the end of World War I. The Russian army was very weak. There was uprising, the change of the government. So Ukraine was able to separate relatively peacefully. They signed the new documents. They established their own country. It was called Ukrainian People's Republic, UPR. But between 1917 and 1922, there was civil war in Russia. And also at the same time, they grabbed Ukraine back pretty much. So they put their forces in, they came in. Unfortunately, some of the Ukrainians were also against independence. So they were fighting on the Russian side. But in the end of the day, they were able to invade it back. And in fact, in 1922, when the civil war in Russia was done and the communists finally came to power, they created Soviet Union. And interestingly, Ukraine becomes one of the founding members of the Soviet Union together with Russia. Okay, so Ukrainian, Russia, and Belarus, those three big pieces, big republics, they created Soviet Union. And then, of course, they added more. So eventually, Soviet Union had 15 republics. Now, what's interesting is that as brutal as communists were at that time, and dictatorship, of course, and everything, they were pretty liberal in terms of the charter of the Soviet Union. When those republics signed in 1922 the creation of Soviet Union, one of the clause in that charter was that every republic has the right to separate from the Soviet Union at any time. All right, so every republic has the right for identity and separation if they desire to do so. So later on, Ukraine and other republics would use that provision when the Soviet Union breaks up. That's how actually it's broken up, because legally every republic had the right to separate. And eventually that's exactly what happened in 1991. So anyway, starting from 1922, Ukraine is part of Soviet Union. And Soviet Union realizes that Ukraine has vast, fertile land, and Ukraine becomes so-called breadbasket of the Soviet Union, breadbasket of the USSR. Very rich country in terms of natural resources, again, especially in terms of the land. This black soil that Ukraine had and still has is unique. You can't find it anywhere else in the world. Pretty much anything you drop just grows, okay? So that makes it even more ridiculous that between 1932 and 1933, Ukrainians were starving. And in fact, it killed millions of people. It's called Holodomor, but it's pretty much man-made famine, okay? It was a man-made famine created by Stalin's regime. The idea was to pretty much take away every crops, every cattle, livestock, pretty much anything that is in Ukraine, take it away from them. Why? It's still debatable. The main thought is that Stalin simply wanted to take this away and sell it so that he could use the money to pretty much advance his agenda. And of course, it's genocide, but some historians believe that it was not done on purpose, meaning that Stalin understood that he is killing Ukrainians, but he did not, it was not his main purpose. His main purpose was just to grab that stuff, sell it, and have the money. He understood that millions of Ukrainians would die, but he didn't care. Another line of experts believe that he actually created it on purpose to eliminate as many Ukrainians as possible, because again, he viewed Ukrainian nation as a threat down the road. So it's hard to say who is right, but in most sources, Holodomor is considered intentional genocide. Okay, so as you can see, Ukraine is not happy. It's not happy within the Soviet Union. Obviously, after this terrible situation, it's very hard to live in the same state. So Ukrainians are looking for the ways. They're looking for the ways to break out, to separate somehow. And then another opportunity arises in 1941. That's unfortunately, because that's when Nazis actually invaded Ukraine. And in 1941, when Germans came in, Ukraine and Belarus were the first republics of the Soviet Union that were invaded. And at that time, Nazis promised Ukrainians, some of the Ukrainians, that if they collaborate, they will get independence of Soviet Union. And unfortunately, at that time, a few nationalistic organizations were created in Ukraine. This little dark period in Ukrainian history, by very few, not the majority, but very few nationalistic organizations, maybe 5% of people were, collaborating with Nazis. That still haunts Ukraine by now, because that's what Putin is using by always referring to Ukrainians as Nazis, because in 1941, for a very short period of time, some small percentage of Ukrainians collaborated with Nazis because they believed that that would help them to acquire independence. Now, of course, it was a very brief period. By the end of 1941, everybody realized that, Nazi collaboration is not a good idea, because in fact, they were killing millions of Ukrainians. So Ukrainians just drove them out together with Soviet Union Red Army. So, Ukrainian front was one of the most powerful military actions of the Red Army. And, the majority of Red Army that actually fought for Ukraine were, of course, Ukrainians. So when we say that, they were Nazis in Ukraine, yeah, maybe, of course, there is no denial that there were some nationalistic groups, but it's nowhere near being widespread. And of course, it's not the case right now. So now in the process, of course, 5 to 7 million lives were taken. 5 to 7 million Ukrainians died in World War II in general, including, again, one of the darkest history of the mankind. 1.5 million of Jewish people were killed. And one of the most important landmarks of Holocaust is in Ukraine, in Kiev. It's called Babi Yar. It's one of the largest massacres in the history of Holocaust. Almost 34,000 Jewish people were killed and buried in mass graves in Ukraine. So this is just the picture of how it used to look at that time. As you can see, it's horrifying. People are being buried in the mass graves like this. And again, the reason I'm showing you this is just to demonstrate how sensitive Ukrainians are to this matter and how they appreciate what they have right now. And, there is absolutely no trace of any Nazi collaboration or anything like that. Here you see the picture. By the way, in 2021, we had 80th anniversary. So there was a big ceremony of commemoration of victims of Babi Yar. So here's the man praying at the ceremony. Here is Zelensky, who is Jewish, who is again takes part in commemoration ceremony. This is the mayor of Kiev, Vladimir Klitschko, who is the famous boxer, if you hear, one of the most successful heavyweight fighters in the history of boxing, also commemorates. And again, as I said, my father is Jewish. I lived in Ukraine all my life. Never ever I heard anything related to nationalism in its bad form. So I have no idea how is it possible to convince people in Russia that they truly believe that there are Nazis in Ukraine, that it's Nazi regime, that they are fighting Nazis. It just doesn't make any sense. So again, from my experience and from what I see in Ukraine, from what I hear, it's nowhere near. It's just not the case. So, all right, World War ended, and then another important moment in Ukrainian history. In 1954, the USSR transfers Crimea to Soviet Ukraine. Another mistake, unfortunately. So what happened is Nikita Khrushchev, who followed Stalin as the general secretary of Communist Party, he used to be the head of the Communist Party in Ukraine. So he liked Ukraine. Ukrainian lobby was pretty powerful at that time. So they figured, okay, why don't we just transfer Crimea to Soviet Ukraine? After all, it's a union. Nobody's going to separate. The country is very solid. Geographically, Crimea made more sense as part of Ukraine because it had land connection to Ukraine. It did not have any land connection to Russia. So they figured from logistics perspective, from management perspective, Crimea should be part of Ukraine. Now we regret that it happened because it triggered this whole thing, because, Crimea was the first territory that Russia decided to annex. But anyway, it happened in 1954. Then another important event, 1986, I'm sure you're all aware of it. It's Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Again, it happened in Ukraine, unfortunately. And why it's significant, of course, it's technogenic catastrophe, but it also resulted in political demise of the whole Soviet system, because it demonstrated how terrible the system is, how inefficient the government is, and the fact that the information is not delivered to people in times like this is just insane. So again, Chernobyl happened, people are partying outside because it was between May 1 and May 9. That's the holiday season in Soviet Union. May 1 is the Labor Day version of Soviets, and May 9 is the Victory Day. So during those 10 days, everybody is outside. I remember I was 9-year-old at that time. And I remember really vividly how I was partying outside, doing barbecue in the forest with my parents, with my friends. For 10 days, the radiation was coming from Chernobyl and nobody knew about it, okay? So it happened, but information was not disseminated at all. So people were breathing it, people were swimming in the river. Believe it or not, in May, sometimes you can swim in Ukraine. So of course, when people eventually found out, when they couldn't hide it anymore, it became apparent that this union just cannot exist. It's just a terrible political system. The economy was already not doing well. Plus, of course, the arms race and the oil prices went down. So, you know, all those contributing factors eventually resulted in collapse of Soviet Union. And the way that collapse happened is, as I mentioned to you earlier, those 15 republics of Soviet Union used the provision in the original charter of Soviet Union that every republic has the right to separate if they wish to do so. And that's exactly what they did. Ukraine became independent state. And what's also very important, at that time, Ukraine had second largest nuclear arsenal in Soviet Union. Of course, Russia had number one, Ukraine was number two. And Ukraine being a peaceful nation and realizing that it's important to, slow down the spread of nuclear arms as much as possible, they just agreed to give it up for free. You know, unlike other countries like North Korea, who are trying to get bargains and everything, Ukrainians just gave it for free. They just figured, we don't want it. We don't want any problems. We don't want any kind of potential threats to the mankind. So let's just give it away. The only thing we're asking is some kind of guarantee that our sovereignty, our sovereign status is going to be maintained. Okay. And it was signed by Russia, USA, and UK. So at that time, we thought, okay, it's as good as gold. You know, three major powers, they're signing agreement, and those agreements are worth something. And that was called Budapest Memorandum. Now, of course, we all know where that memorandum is right now. So it turned out to be absolutely useless. It was violated in the most brutal manner. But anyway, that would happen in '94. So we were hoping that would help us with the security. Then between '91 and 2004, Ukraine existed as an independent state with no problems, mainly because it was mostly pro-Russian. Okay, we had a few pro-Russian presidents. Some of them were leaning Russia a lot. Some of them were more neutral, but none of them really wanted to shift away from Russia and towards the West. So that was relatively calm period between 1991 and 2004 in terms of political situation. Economically, of course, there were troubles all the time, but that's a different story. But then something happened in 2004. We had another pro-Russian candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, but this time they pushed it way too hard because the guy was, absolute fraud. People at that time already started feeling that maybe it's time to change something. It was not even political will of people. It was more of economical thing. They figured Russia is not going anywhere economically. It's just a big state that, sells natural resources to the rest of the world. There is not much innovation going on. The regime is not, liberal enough. So we want to change. We want to move towards Europe and completely change our economic system. We just wanted to become a true market economy. Okay. Had nothing to do with politics, had nothing to do with, hating Russia or not hating Russia. It was just pure economic decision. So Ukrainian people wanted to move towards joining European Union. Okay. Well, but Russia, of course, did not want that to happen. So they had their own candidate, as always, the one that was financed by Russian special forces and, political establishment, Viktor Yanukovych. But, the pro-Western candidate, Viktor Yushchenko, was winning in the hearts and minds of people. But somehow, Viktor Yanukovych was declared the winner because of the widespread, electoral fraud. And that was so-called Orange Revolution. That's when people in Ukraine went to street. First time in their history, they went to streets, they protested. It was relatively peaceful. Nobody died. And eventually, Supreme Court overruled and annulled the results of the election. And there was a new election scheduled, the runoff, a repeated runoff. And during that runoff, Viktor Yushchenko actually won. Now, what's interesting is in the process, he almost died, Viktor Yushchenko, because he was poisoned by the Russian special forces. The way they like doing it, using some kind of poison. He survived, but he still has some marks on his face. It was dioxin. I think that's how they call the poison. But anyway, he won. And at that point, that was probably one of the most important pivots in Ukrainian history, when Ukraine started pivoting towards Russia. And that's where Russia started really worrying. So Ukraine shifted its political vector towards the West and away from Russia. At that time, Ukraine society also splits into pro-Russian, which is Eastern and Southern Ukraine, and pro-Western, which is Central and Western Ukraine. But again, peacefully. It's like Republicans and Democrats here, right? You have two parties, you have two different beliefs, but they still coexist peacefully. So everything can be solved through normal civilized elections. All right. Same as in Ukraine. Yes, there were people who were leaning Russia, people who were leaning West, but not to the point of any kind of civil war. But Russia was afraid that eventually that movement toward the West will result in Ukraine being lost for Russia forever. And they start putting unprecedented economic pressure on Ukraine. Again, I was there at that time. And I just remember all this blackmailing using natural gas. So the scheme is pretty simple. You don't do what we want, we raise the gas price by 50%. You don't do it again, we double it. Okay, so every time they have new agreement, every year they sign new agreement between Russia and Ukraine, and they would just jack up the prices at will. Okay, now Ukraine was able to survive that because we had our own arguments. And it turns out that the gas that was coming from Russia to Europe was coming from the transport system that was located in Ukraine. So Russia will raise the gas price, we would raise the transit rate. Okay, so whatever we have to pay more in terms of actual gas that we consume, we compensate for it by making money on more expensive transit. And that's why, again, Russia pushed so hard for all those new transit lines that go around Ukraine, like Nord Stream 2, Turkish Stream, and so on and so forth. So anyway, that was the period where there was a lot of economic tension between Ukraine and Russia. Anyway, in the end of the day, we survived it, but Russia had a temporary win because people felt like economically it's becoming very difficult, and Yanukovych becomes president. So the guy who was not able to become president due to fraud initially ended up being president from the second attempt. And Ukraine moves back to Russia again in terms of its political and economic vector. But Yanukovych turned out to be the wrong candidate for Russia. They should have thought a little bit better who they actually put in power, because his character was just not right. He was a pure thug. He was former criminal. His governing style was terrible, very authoritarian, almost like racketeering businesses. I had a lot of friends in Ukraine who had businesses, and they were pretty much taken away from them. And corruption was unprecedented. So people just couldn't live under those circumstances. And what really put the last straw is that Yanukovych rejects a pending European Union association agreement between Ukraine and European Union. Because remember, when Yushchenko became president, Ukraine started moving towards joining European Union, and all the legal work has started. We filed the application, we got approval, but then Yanukovych comes in and he rejects it. Instead, he gets the bailout loan from Russia. So what Putin did, he pretty much came to Yanukovych and said, you can join European Union, but I can guarantee you economic collapse because I will put pressure on you. Or alternatively, I could give you a lot of money, $20 billion at that time, and you could use that as a bailout and do whatever you want with it. So he went for, Russian bailout loan. He rejected the European Union Association Agreement. That really pissed off the people of Ukraine. They went to streets again, and we had something that's called Maidan, or Revolution of Dignity. This one turned out to be a lot more brutal, because at that point, Yanukovych and his friends, obviously in Russian regime, they realized that that's their last chance. And 130 people died on the streets in a couple of days, but they were killed. They were killed by police forces. But eventually, the people's will overcame the government forces. Yanukovych flees the country with the help of Russian operatives. He ends up being somewhere in Russia. And at that time, realizing that Ukraine is probably gone for good for Russia, they annexed Crimea, because they realized that's it. Ukraine is moving towards the European Union. They might become NATO members. So they just come in, they use all the chaos in Ukrainian army, all this chaos in political situation, and they just came in and they just annexed Crimea. Also, they stimulated and sponsored uprising in the historically pro-Russian Donbas region, the one where all the fighting is right now, but that's when it started. It started in 2014. And they created so-called Donetsk People's Republic, DPR, and Luhansk People Republic, LPR. Those are absolutely puppet regimes of Russia. There is no doubt about that. But, they had people who were learning Russian, who liked, speaking Russian language, who were brainwashed, and they were fighting. They were fighting with Ukraine since 2014. So if you ask me when the conflict started, that's when it started. It started in 2014. So as you can see on this picture, I don't know if you see my cursor moving, but this red area, that's that DPR and LPR regions that are right now recognized by Russia as independent states, but they're not recognized by anybody else in the world, okay? Including Russia's allies like Belarus and Kazakhstan, even they did not recognize those. Okay, so in 2014, the new president comes, Petro Poroshenko. He is elected, and of course, he's trying to fight the war. Plus, the corruption is still through the roof, and there is a military conflict. So, of course, it's not going well for Ukraine. And this war needs to end, right? The conflict between Ukraine and the Donbas region needed to end. And that's when the Minsk agreement came into play in 2015. I'm not going to bore you with all the details of all these main points in Minsk agreement, but number 10 and number 11 are the crucial ones. So basically, it's an agreement between Ukrainian government and the separatists in that Donbas region. And point number 10 says that there need to be withdrawal of all foreign armed formations, military equipment, and mercenaries. And number 11 says that Ukraine, on the other hand, needs to create some kind of constitutional reform that would include decentralization with specific mention of Donetsk and Luhansk region, meaning that pretty much give them more autonomy, right? And decentralize the whole Ukrainian system. And Putin was blaming Ukraine for not following Minsk agreement for so many years. And he said, well, I could not stand it anymore. I had to interfere and defend Donbas region because Ukraine was not holding their part of the agreement. But the Ukrainian argument is, well, before we do 11, we need to have, we need to have 10. First, we need to withdraw all the foreign armed forces, military equipment, and mercenaries. And that's where the problem is, because Russia still doesn't recognize that they have their forces in Donbas region. They say these are not foreign armed formations. They say these are just rebellions of Donbas, which of course is not true. So that's the problem. You know, between 10 and 11, both parties were pretty much blaming each other for not holding to their parts of that agreement. In the end of the day, the agreement just fell apart. Nobody decided to, nobody enforced it. And as a result, the conflict in Donbas continued up until, the full-blown war with Russia started. So Minsk agreement falls apart very quickly, and fighting in Donbas continues. In 2019, we elect Volodymyr Zelensky, the current president. Ukraine continues its course on European integration and joining NATO. Even with the economy struggling and Zelensky approval rating being really low, Ukraine still continues its course on joining European Union and NATO. There is no threat to Russia in any way. We are saying we are peaceful, we don't have nuclear weapons. Obviously, there are no Nazis or anything like that. It's just the country that wants to do what it wants to do, right? Everybody has the right to pursue their own goals and dreams and aspirations. So Ukraine just wanted to continue to move in that direction. Putin being frustrated, okay, with the fact that, even Donbas conflict doesn't help him, because he was hoping that that Donbas conflict will eventually somehow disintegrate Ukraine, pulls it apart, and then he will come in and grab it. That didn't help to him either. Ukraine was continuing moving in the direction that he did not like. So that's why eventually he invaded. But anyway, Zelensky is the president. We are moving in the Western direction, but the economy is not doing well. And also, I don't know if you know, I'm sure you know, Zelensky's background is interesting. He's just a comedian, an actor, and very young guy with no experience in politics or economy. That makes him not very respected among the people. Initially, they elect him because they wanted to change so desperately, but then they realized that he's young, he has good intentions, but he's young, inexperienced, and he's making strange personnel decisions. He's putting people in charge who are not professionals, but, ambitious maybe. So anyway, his approval rating is not high. Basically, in 2021, his approval rating was pretty much at around 28%. I don't think that anything like that ever happened in the US. Even Trump at his lowest, I don't think he ever had that low, but 28% only. You will see later, right now it's 95, actually 85, I'm sorry. So right now it's 85. So the guy who was almost nobody now is the hero. That contributed to invasion as well, because according to Putin's calculations and the intelligence, he thought, well, economy in Ukraine is struggling. There is a conflict in Donbas. People don't like Zelensky. They don't respect him. He thought, okay, now I'm just going to come in. I will sell it to the world as if I'm just liberating struggling Ukraine. And suddenly everybody's going to meet me with flowers and cheer. And it's going to be a 2-day affair. Within 48, 72 hours, I'll be done. So that was a major miscalculation. Okay. So anyway, then in February, as you know, 22, Russia invades Ukraine, citing the following reasons: widespread Nazification of Ukraine, mass killings in Donbas people, of Donbas people by Ukrainian army, direct threat to Russia if Ukraine joins NATO. And number 4, intelligence reports that Ukraine is planning to attack Russia and Belarus, so preventive strike is needed. It's hard to come up with more ridiculous statements, of course. It's just, you know, it's just laughable, really. So number 1, widespread Nazification. You know, you saw what I showed you, how people respect this heritage of Holocaust, and how, you know, even the president is Jewish, and people have free speech, and they can speak any language they want, except, of course, Ukrainian is official, Russian is not official, but, you know, English is official, and Spanish is official in US, but in France, French is only official language. So it's the choice of the country which language to make official. So other than that, there is absolutely nothing related to Nazification or even nationalism. Mass killings of Donbas people by Ukrainian army, also not true. Ukraine doesn't even have weapons to actually do mass killings. As we all know right now, there are no offensive weapons. We have only defensive weapons, and even that was in big shortage. Number 3, direct threat to Russia if Ukraine joins NATO. Very debatable. It is true, if you look at this picture, that NATO expanded substantially. So as you can see, the purple is countries that joined NATO before 1997, and the yellow is countries that joined NATO after 1997. So yes, if Ukraine joins NATO, you know, there is a substantial border between NATO and Russia. But, you know, in retrospective, it may seem like it's a threat, but how can you threaten nuclear power like this? Especially, you know, if country like Ukraine that already gave up its nuclear weapons and absolutely peaceful. So that argument is also very, very weak, especially now, given that when Sweden and Finland announced their desire to join NATO, suddenly Russia says it's not a threat, even though the border between Finland and Russia is probably as big, if not bigger, than the one between Ukraine and Russia. So suddenly it's not an issue at all. But as a reason to invade Ukraine, looked like it was a legitimate argument for Putin. So again, doesn't make any sense. And finally, the most ridiculous ones is intelligence reports that Ukraine is planning to attack Russia and Belarus. This is just insane. You know, the country that is struggling economically, the country that doesn't have offensive weapons, the country that is busy just rebuilding and making sure that they join European Union, suddenly they want to attack Russia or Belarus. It's just crazy. So anyway, under all those bogus reasons, Russia invades. So the goals, initially declared goals, were to quickly defeat Ukrainian army and destroy its military infrastructure, remove Zelensky from office and replace him with a pro-Russian puppet regime. Some people were talking about Yanukovych actually coming back. So that would put Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence. So that was the quick plan. Of course, this failed. We all know what happened. Russia failed to achieve either of those goals for a couple of reasons. Number 1 is Russia underestimated the power of the Ukrainian military. And number 2, which is probably more important, it did not expect so much resistance from the Ukrainian people, not just military, but from people in general. So when they came close to Kiev, hundreds of thousands of people started just grabbing weapons and just defending their homes and their territories. Everybody I know did something to contribute to defense. You know, my brother-in-law, he joined the militia pretty much. You know, he got the gun and he was kind of protecting the warehouses. Businesses, you know, helping a lot. I'm going to talk about that in a moment. Again, the think tanks were all working to contribute to the intelligence and statistics related to the war. So we're going to talk about that a little later. But the point is, the resistance was tremendous. Nobody was, you know, greeting Russians with flowers and cheers. So that was miscalculation. And finally, of course, the resolve of the West to help Ukraine. Putin thought that, you know, NATO is not united. The West is not united, that somehow the economic concerns will overpower the desire to help the free nation like Ukraine, and eventually there will be some kind of deal. The sanctions are not going to be powerful enough, and somehow Russia would be able to go through it. And there was a good reason to believe that, because that's exactly what happened after Crimea was annexed. Russia just came in, grabbed the territory of another country, and nothing happened. Well, we had some sanctions, but those sanctions did not really do anything. So they thought exactly the same is going to happen. Now, of course, it didn't happen. So Russia had to withdraw from the central part of Ukraine, central and northern part of Ukraine, and focus its attention on east and south part of Ukraine. So the plan right now is to invade entirely Donbas region, and then possibly grab some southern territories of Ukraine so that they could build the land corridor that would allow them to go by land from Russia to Crimea. Okay, so if you look at this chart, and that's April 10. I mean, right now it may have changed because Russians gained some territories in one area, but they were pushed back in another area. So, for example, if you see this, I don't know if you see me showing the cursor here, but there is this Kharkiv region. Okay, right now, I mean, as of April 10th, it's all red, meaning that's where Russian has control. They got very close to Kharkiv, they almost to Kharkiv. If you look at the new map, they're pushed out. They're not here anymore. Okay, but on the other hand, they gained more ground here in the eastern and southern part. Okay, but again, the goal is to have this eastern and southern territories so that they can move freely to Crimea and to complete control of Black Sea, and possibly even get Odessa region. That would actually take away the completely take away access of Ukraine to the Black Sea. All right, so that's where all the fighting is going on right now. So as you can see, the goals of Russia are much more modest. They're not dreaming about, taking down Kiev and taking down regime anymore. They just want to get at least something in the east and in the southern Ukraine. So what is the life in Ukraine right now? Well, of course, thousands of people have been killed, as we know it. 7.7 million Ukrainians have been displaced, roughly every 6 Ukrainian. Everybody I know moved, except my parents, luckily, and parents of my wife, because they are in Cherkasy region, which is relatively close to Kiev, but there was never fighting in that area. Somehow it falls into that, black hole, if you wish, where there is no fighting. Okay. But a lot of people had to move, especially initially when Kiev was attacked, because, Kiev is a 3 million people city. So a lot of people had to flee. Now they're all coming back because it seemed to be relatively safe in that area. Of course, significant portion of infrastructure is destroyed. Double-digit inflation, especially gas prices are through the roof. Of course, we are complaining that gas is expensive here, but it's nowhere near expensive as it is in Ukraine. On top of it, there is a shortage. So not only it's expensive, you cannot also even buy it. So, that's a major problem. Even more important, the shortage of essential drugs, including insulin. Like if you're diabetic type 1, you're in big trouble. So there is no access to insulin. My father is diabetic, but he's type 2. So luckily he does not need insulin, but a lot of people do. Eastern and southern parts of Ukraine, like Mariupol, for example, are pretty much unlivable, completely destroyed, leveled. Okay. So most of the war casualties were actually in those regions. So even though there was fighting in Kiev, Chernihiv, and you saw this really crazy, brutal images of civilians being killed in Kiev area, luckily there are not many, right? There are hundreds, maybe thousands, but not nearly as many as in Eastern and Southern Ukraine. Because over there, it's just pretty much, it's massacre. It's like mass killing going on over there. People who did not evacuate, they just live in horrible conditions, no electricity, shortages of everything, water, food, constant bombing, shelling. It's just terrible. Central Ukraine is relatively safe, but still subject to occasional airstrikes. Pretty much, Western Ukraine, the same thing. It's relatively safe, it's the safest spot, but still, recently we had some airstrike on Lviv, the western city in Ukraine. So the tactics of Russia is very simple. Try to bomb the hell out of Ukraine, pretty much, and then maybe use the actual forces to gain some ground. Unfortunately for them, they cannot effectively fight Russia, excuse me, Ukraine on the field, because Ukrainian army is extremely efficient, very well trained, and right now well funded because of all this help from the West, including Western weapons. So it's very difficult for Russia to really win the battle on the field, but they still have a lot of missiles, they still have a lot of bombs, so they keep just randomly, well, some of it is random just to create some kind of panic, but some of it is targeted infrastructure or some kind of warehouses of weapons. So they just keep bombing and bombing and bombing, creating really, really terrible conditions within the country. So despite all the struggles, Ukrainians are actually in good spirit. They are united as never before. They are not terribly depressed. Of course, the mood is not cheerful. It's not like they're laughing and smiling, but they're focused. They're focused and united. Even when I called my brother, my sister-in-law, I talked to them, even my parents, they look alert and focused, okay, not panicking. So they learn to live in that kind of environment, and they have resolve. They're not going to give up their land. They're not going to cave in. They will fight. So the Ukrainian military is fighting effectively. Hundreds of thousands of civilians joined the civil defense forces, so-called Teroborona. Businesses step in and help the fight by donating money, products, services, vehicles, facilities. Again, a few examples. As I said, my brother is in logistics. That's his business. So he is now arranging the delivery of humanitarian cargos from Western Europe to Ukraine. My sister-in-law, their firm, their company, they donated the whole huge warehouse of medical supplies to the military needs. I'm affiliated with the Kiev School of Economics, the university. That's my alma mater. That's where I graduated from. And right now, I'm the deputy chair of their academic advisory board. So I know what's going on there on a regular basis. So what they're doing right now, instead of holding classes, actually now they resume teaching, believe it or not, because things became relatively safe in Kiev. But during the first several weeks of war, when teaching was impossible, they stopped doing all educational programs, and instead they refocused and regrouped, and they started doing analytics for the army. Okay, they were collecting data, they were processing data, they were doing projections, pretty much anything they could, because they're pretty technical. They have econometricians, statisticians, they have economists over there. So they pretty much converted themselves into think tank that would help the country during the war. So also we have unprecedented support from the West, and for that I want to thank everybody, including just ordinary American people and also people from all over the world. The amount of empathy I see is unprecedented. I'm even surprised, actually, at how people react everywhere. The amount of donations. In fact, it's almost like Ukraine now have even too much money. They don't know what to do with it. Okay, so right now the trouble is how to use it in the right way. And as I mentioned, the president's approval rating is above 90%. So as you can see, the guy who a few months ago had 28% approval rating now has 90% approval rating. And I hear here in this country, I wish we had him as a president. So, so stuff like that. So he did end up being a hero. Again, I don't know how it's going to be eventually, if he is a good strategist, if he is smart and intelligent enough to really strategically win this war. But what is definitely true about him is his spirit. He had a chance to leave. he was offered, to evacuate, and you know what his answer was, don't give me a ride. I don't need a ride. I need ammunition. All right, give me arms. So he has some guts, and people are united around him, and that's just a big problem for Putin and his regime. So the last thing I want to mention is how long it will last and where it's going to go. Nobody knows the answer, but there are a couple of things that point towards a very long-lasting conflict, unfortunately. Number one, Russia is determined to achieve its goals. Otherwise, it will be the end of Putin's regime. Looks like he just can't lose this war, because if he does, that's it for him and perhaps even for Russia in general. It would be something similar to collapse of Soviet Union, when Soviet Union could not win arms race, and also Chernobyl, like significant disappointment to all the people within the country who believed in that regime. And now to lose the war to Ukraine, that's just not good. That's not going to fly in Russia. They're trying to spin it and now say that they're not fighting Ukraine anymore. Now they're saying in their propaganda media, they're saying that they're fighting the world. They say they're fighting NATO. That's what they say. Because they just cannot admit the fact that somehow they cannot beat Ukrainian army. They say, we are not fighting Ukrainian army, we are fighting NATO. We are fighting this proxy war. But still, they are determined to achieve their own goals. Number two, Ukraine is determined, on the other hand, to fight and demonstrates that it can do it effectively. In fact, they just said outright that there will be no negotiations unless, all their territories are returned back to Ukraine. So they're not willing to give up anything that Russia gained since February. But more importantly, Ukraine is not willing to give up anything that Russia got before that, including Crimea. So that is very, very difficult to achieve. So honestly, I think Ukrainians' position on that is probably even too strong. But again, I might be thinking more as somebody who just wants to save lives primarily. But to me, getting back Crimea is almost impossible at this point. But that's what Ukraine claims they want. They say they're not going to give up. They will be fighting until the end. The third factor is that the West is determined to continue its support, because looks like right now, US and the Western allies, they view this war as the opportunity to end Putin's regime. Because basically, again, it's a window of opportunity to, defeat his military to some extent, to create some kind of resistance within the Russia, economically and politically and militarily deliver him this defeat, and maybe it would be a chance to remove him from the power, because everybody understands right now that he is a real threat to the world, not just Ukraine. So it looks like stakes are very high, and none of the sides is willing to give in. So unfortunately, all of those factors seem to point towards a rather prolonged war. So again, I don't know what can be done to resolve this conflict, but to me, there are a couple of steps that needed to be made. Number one is embargo on Russian oil and gas, because unfortunately, if it ends up being war of attrition, Russia could probably last longer than Ukraine. No matter how much money we get from the West, Russia is still a very rich country, because they can channel all of their revenues towards military without worrying about what their people think. All right. It's not US, where every dollar is counted. Okay. In Russia, if they need extra $10 billion to finance military, they will do it. They will take it away from social welfare. They will take it away from economic development. They don't care. From healthcare, they will just continue channeling those funds to the war as much as they can. And if you're able to earn more than $300 billion a year from exporting oil and gas, you can last very, very long time. And it turns out that despite all the sanctions, the revenue of Russia's economy from export of oil and gas is only rising. Okay, so something needs to be done in that aspect. So embargo on Russian oil and gas is, of course, a very important step. Now, we all understand that there is a lot of opposition to that, because Europe depends on it a lot. So it needs to be done slowly, gradually. So we'll see. Number two, supply Ukraine with all the necessary weapons, because, you know, if Ukraine is determined to fight, at least give them a chance to do it more effectively. Number three, which I think is probably the most important in my view, my personal view, is to widen the anti-Russian coalition, which would include China and India, especially China. Unfortunately, China is supporting Russia, at least you know, publicly. Luckily, they're not supporting it very actively. They're not giving them weapons or money yet, but it would be a lot better if China, you know, publicly opposes the war and maybe even joins the sanctions. So of course, it's very unlikely to happen because geopolitically, China is the rival of the US. But presumably, economically, there are so many ties. You know, the trade between US and China and the rest of the world is so big that it's almost like it's not worth it for China to sacrifice its relationship with the West in order to cozy up with Russia. So if somehow China is brought in, that would probably do it, because then Putin would be left really alone in this fight. And finally, that's what Europeans are pushing right now, is to explore any possible option for a diplomatic solution and give Putin a golden bridge. So what I mean by that is to help him save his face, because looks like he already realizes that he's not going to win this war the way he wants to win it. He's not going to invade Ukraine. He's not going to change regime. He's not going to occupy Kiev. At best, he could probably get those territories. But one thing is to get them. Another thing is to keep them occupied, because the people will be fighting until the end. You need to really be able to maintain all that. And that requires a lot of resources, and it requires the allegiance from the locals. And he doesn't have it. He has it in Donbass, but he's not going to have it in Odessa. He is not having it in Kherson. So it's going to be very difficult for him. So one of the ways to end it is for Ukraine to perhaps give up some of the territories, perhaps the ones that they were not they were not Ukrainians before the war started. Basically, those problematic Donbas regions, and just say, okay, let's move back to the borders that were before February, and let's talk about that later. But for now, let's just stop all the fighting. So that's what Europeans want. So if you hear in news lately, there were some talks from Macron, from Scholz, the German chancellor, that maybe Ukraine has to somehow give up some of its ground, some of its territory, in order to stop this craziness, and then Putin would sell it to his public, as the victory, and he would say, all right, we destroyed some military infrastructure and we gained some territory, we liberated people of Donbass. And of course, propaganda works extremely effectively in Russia, and that would save his face and perhaps end this war. But again, Ukrainians are not buying that argument, and I don't know if it's likely to happen. So anyway, that's basically what I wanted to say. This is just a couple of websites where you can donate to Ukraine, but I think I sent it to you a long time ago when it all started. So it's not a big deal. There are many websites these days, like United Help, Razom. You can look my email that I sent you a long time ago and check. There are a few more organizations if you're willing to transfer any money to Ukrainians. But again, it's a very unfortunate situation. Nobody knows how it's going to happen. We can just hope that somehow the common sense will prevail, and either Putin backs out, or something happens inside Russia and he's just taken out by his own people, or maybe there will be some kind of diplomatic solution. But again, it's very hard to imagine when it's going to happen. So we might be talking about a few months, if not a few years, of this conflict continuing. So again, I think we are right on time. So it's 1 p.m. Thank you all for being here and listening these things. So if you guys have any questions or any discussion, just go ahead, let me know. But again, thank you all. Thank you very much. Anybody has any questions, concerns, suggestions?
Dmytro, if I can ask you a question about what's the situation of the consensus to the Putin regime in Russia. You mentioned at the beginning of the talk that you know there has been a lot of interconnection between the area, and you probably hear people from Russia and try to understand what they say. You say that the propaganda machine in Russia is very strong. I have no doubt about that. But I keep being, I don't know what's the right word, just surprised about how little of the information that we're exposed to can actually reach not only the ordinary Russians, but I mean, even other academics or so. So I just wanted to ask you what is your impression of that, and if anything can be done to improve the situation, to make sure that less biased information can reach the ordinary Russian and Belarusian.
Yeah, no, I hear your point, and unfortunately, as you say, propaganda works so effectively. But also remember that propaganda did not start in February. Propaganda started in 2014 and even before that. So the Russian people have been brainwashed for so long that it's easy for them to buy this argument right now. They believe that Ukraine is a Nazi state. And I can give you an example. You mentioned that even in academia, right? You could hear that. My uncle, right? He is the member of Academy of Science of Russia. He is professor. He's not academics. He's not teaching at the university, but he used to be, the director of the coal mining enterprise in Rostov-on-Don. Okay, very intellectual. His PhD, doctoral degree from Russia. He calls my father, on FaceTime and talks to him on a regular basis, and they just keep fighting. They just keep arguing because he keeps telling my father that Russia is doing the right thing. It's just unbelievable. So it's hard to understand why it's like that. I guess because, propaganda works so effectively. Social media is available primarily to young people. Older people, older generation don't seem to worry about social media that much. And young people are just not active enough. So they just don't care. And somehow it's just not penetrating. It's just not penetrating the minds. Of course, as I said, I'm on the board of that school, and one of the members is Konstantin Sonin, who works at University of Chicago. He's economist, I think he's economist, or maybe he's management person. I'm not sure, but he is from Russia. And he understands the situation, so he actively opposes the war. He posts on Twitter, on Facebook. So obviously there are smart people there who understand the situation, but the vast majority is just brainwashed. And I don't know how they do it. I really don't know. I guess they have talented people over there, and they just know how to influence the minds. So yeah, it would be an important step to overcome this public opinion, but they just believe that there is existential threat to Russia. They believe that Ukraine is Nazi state that was planning to attack Russia, or at least join NATO and move the NATO military close to the border of Russian state. And there is nothing we can do about it. It's almost. So I wish I had answered to your question. I don't know. That's why, that's why I'm doing things like this, because maybe some Russian and you tell them, and then someone else tell them. So it's just like we're trying to spread the word as much as we can. Because one thing is to understand some legitimate arguments and and say, well, it's political arguments, it's sphere of influence, at least it's understandable. But when the argument is that Ukraine is Nazi state, it's just so wrong that it's just hard to believe that somehow it penetrated Russian minds so deeply, and they truly believe in that nonsense. So I don't know, but you're absolutely right. That would be the first step in ending this thing is to somehow make sure that public opinion changes. Looks like it's changing slowly. Slowly, I start hearing here and there some incidences of military not fighting, or some reporters resigning, or even recently some deputy ambassador in some country, Russian deputy ambassador, I forgot his name, he publicly resigned, and he said, you know, I'm not going to work for Russian embassy anymore. I'm done. I'm staying here. I'm not coming back. So we hear things here and there, but not nearly enough. It looks like Russian people are actually united, believe it or not. They are united in this war, just like Ukrainians are. So, yeah. Yadranka, please. Yadranka, you were saying?
Yeah. So, you can hear me. So there was this first trial of a Russian soldier in Ukraine for murder. Are there any additional trials in?
Not that I heard of. Not that I heard of. But again, I think that Russians will fight back by trying Ukrainian soldiers that they just captured. Unfortunately, they captured a lot of Ukrainian soldiers that were protecting Azovstal, you know, that plant, the last stronghold in Mariupol region. They got like a few thousand people over there, and you know they can put them on trial as much as they want, and they will spin it, they will broadcast it, and you know they will say that they are Nazis, and they are just on trial. So I just hope that Ukraine will be able to exchange them somehow. So even though they will go through some public trial, their lives might be saved because Ukraine will just exchange the captives, maybe because you know I feel for those guys because they were really the example of how you fight until the end and don't give up. Yeah, it's a shame, but Garrett.
I have a question about the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and in Russia. Do you can you offer any insight to us whether there's a solution with the church or whether there's conflict?
Yeah,
the church contributes to the conflict between the Ukrainians and the Russians.
Very good question, Garrett. Again, I'm not very religious, but I do know a little bit about that. So basically, it's a known fact that unfortunately in Russia, the church became just a tool, okay? In Russia right now, the Moscow Russian Orthodox Church is just the tool of the Putin's regime. The patriarch, I don't know how it's in English. I think they call it patriarch or like,
yes,
or bishop or archbishop or whatever. Right. The head, let's say the head of the Russian Orthodox Church is one of the best friends of Putin. He actually promotes his agenda through religion. And Ukraine, and that's another reason why Russia is so pissed off at Ukraine, because a few years ago, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which used to be part of overall Russian Orthodox Church, Ukraine broke away. Okay? They decided to split and join the Greek, the Constantinople Church. Okay, that was a big blow to Russia as well, and they did not like that move. But Ukraine, being liberal and understanding that people still have the right to follow their own religion, they did not ban Russian church. They just figured that official church is going to be under Constantinople, but if you want to go to Russian church, you're welcome. You know, all the actual chapels and churches of Russian Orthodox Church are still in Ukraine, and people go there if they wanted to. But now there are some rumors that Ukraine will actually ban it because they view it as another propaganda machine. So again, does it contribute? I think church contributes within Russia for sure, because right. it just helps. Because how can any church support mass killing like that?
Right.
But somehow they found a way to do it, believe it or not. You know, somehow they do make the arguments, and the church is totally behind the regime. They're not coming out publicly and saying the war needs to stop. They don't do that.
Right.
But it's a great question. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Terrible. Yeah. Anybody else? Any questions?
Dmytro,
I'll ask an academic question. What is your sense about what's going on in the universities for the students in the Ukraine? Do you know anything about what's happened to Fulbright students in the Ukraine?
Yeah,
during this?
I'm not sure about Fulbright. I do know that students who were studying during the beginning of the war, especially in Kiev, they stopped. They stopped studying, and they all rushed to somehow transfer somewhere else, including Eastern Europe, Western Europe, even US. There is a lot of movement in universities in the West to help them. And again, we had this board, as I mentioned, board of directors of that Kiev School of Economics, and every member of the board, was trying to figure out how to bring students here in Stony Brook. And the European members stepped up the most, especially the one from Sweden. They offered a lot of places in the Stockholm School of Economics, for example, for those types of students.
Okay.
I worked with our provost, Monica. We were back and forth. She wrote that white paper, that the proposal of how to make things easier for Ukrainian students. And I also know a lot of potential applicants who were supposed to go to the universities, but they couldn't. And now they're asking, people like me and someone else, is it possible to get in the US university? Unfortunately, a lot of deadlines have gone, and you know how bureaucratic things are, especially with visa and immigration. It's very difficult to process all the paperwork on time, especially if embassy is not even working. The US embassy has just resumed its operation in Ukraine only like a few days ago.
Right.
But I hear some personal examples, personal stories of people which are just crazy. For example, a friend of mine, he called me recently. He asked me if his son can apply to Stony Brook. And I was looking for opportunities. I was checking with admissions. And eventually he called me and said, no need, thank you so much. He was already accepted to the University of Chicago. So University of Chicago, 5% acceptance rate, right? They took him with no exams, nothing. They just said, we want to help Ukrainians. There is a huge Ukrainian diaspora in Chicago. But what's more interesting is how he got here in US. He did not have visa, okay? Because at that time, he's 15-year-old. Oh, no, not 15, 17. He did not have visa at that time. Embassy was not working. So they sent him to Colombia, because apparently, if you go to South America, somehow from Ukraine, you can go to South America with no visa. So they sent him to Colombia, from Colombia to Mexico. And then from Mexico, somehow he got that refugee status, and then he got into US, and he lives with his aunt here in New York area. She's here on Staten Island. And now he just got accepted to the University of Chicago. So just imagine that. So you're a young student, potential applicant in Ukraine. The war comes in, you end up going to Colombia, then Mexico, then to New York, and then finally you got accepted to the University of Chicago. So crazy stories.
Wow. Just an observation about Sweden and that part up there. They were, when I was there, they viewed themselves as neutral between Russia and the West, but
not anymore.
Paradoxically, they have rushed to the West. When I was living in Stockholm and I went to Helsinki, they did not view themselves as Westerners when it came to politics or to East-West relations. They viewed themselves as bridges. And boy, did they run
because
the opposite way that they talked when I was there. Yeah,
because they realize how vulnerable they are. I mean, who knows what's in this guy's head? you know, and apparently if you're not a NATO member, you're on your own. So of course, yeah.
Well, the Swedes have a terrific army, so they felt that they could defend themselves, but evidently they said, even though we have a great army, we just soon side with the West on it.
Yeah, that's just another thing that backfired, you know, for Putin.
Yeah.
You know? So it looks like he's losing strategically on every front. You know, it's like,
right.
Yes.
Dmytro, did you have a chance to watch Eurovision, European Song Contest, with Ukraine winning, and Zelensky said that next year it will be in Mariupol?
Oh my God! Yeah, yeah.
So
Yeah.
talking about optimism.
I know. They're talking about whether they can do it in Kiev, though. I mean, more seriously, they're actually thinking if they can do it in Kiev, but you know, I doubt it. But yeah, but Kiev right now is relatively safe, but nothing flies over there. So how are you gonna?
Yeah, but right after they won the contest, Russians were bombing.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Now, speaking of how to get to Ukraine, I had my my mother-in-law here when the war started, and believe it or not, she was, I would say, insane enough to go back to Ukraine. You know, we were telling her, "What are you doing?" She's she lost her husband a while ago, so she is lonely. But you know, her son, you know, my wife's brother is still there in Ukraine. So she just wanted to go back. She just felt like she loves Ukraine so much. She wants to be there. So she wanted to go back. It took her 30 hours to get to Ukraine. So 9 hours on the flight to Warsaw in Poland, then on the bus to the border of Ukraine, then 10 hours at the border, because of the lines and checkups, and then another 10 or 8 hours just to get from the border of Ukraine to her final town. So nonstop, 30 hours on plane, on the bus. So that's how it is logistically right now to get to Ukraine. So it's, I don't know. I don't know how they're going to do things like Eurovision.
She's doing all right.
She's doing okay. She was a little bit sick, initially because of tiredness and everything, but she's fine right now. It's, yeah. So it's, my nephew is semi-celebrity right now as well. So that's another personal story. I don't know if I told you guys, but he's a golfer, very good junior golfer. He's 15 years old, but he's #1 player in Ukraine. And of course, when the war started, all the golf courses were destroyed in a matter of 1 day, because Ukraine is small in terms of golf. There are not many opportunities. So on the golf course where he used to play, they were showing tanks because Russians just made a command point over there. But anyway, seeing this, some American coach reached out to him and said, listen, you cannot play golf in Ukraine. Why don't you come to US? And I'm going to pay for everything. You're going to stay in Orlando, live in the house of my assistant. I'm going to teach you for free. And then I'm going to enroll you into golf academy. So that's how much compassion he had for him. Of course, they had to do it, my brother and sister. So they actually sent him to US when the military fighting was going on in the country. So they drove from Kiev to the western border, trying to make sure that they don't get shot anywhere. Then they smuggled him, well, not smuggled, but officially they moved through the border to Budapest. Then my sister flew him to US because my brother could not get out, because you cannot, if you're between age 18 and 65, you're not allowed to leave the country. So they brought him here to US, left him here alone with the coach. And then my sister-in-law had to go back to Ukraine to join my brother. So now this boy lives here in Orlando pretty much on his own. And his parents are in Ukraine and he's only 15. The only good news is that, he's a celebrity. He had interviews on CNN, Fox News, Golf Digest, At some point he said, I'm tired of all these interviews, just leave me alone,
Has he been on ESPN yet?
I think so. I'm pretty sure he had dinners with Tiger Woods. Right, because they would bring him to all those pro tournaments, and they would put him in that dinner and introduce him, and people were clapping and standing. It's just amazing. It's just amazing how well Americans and Westerners in general reacted to this whole thing. I just sincerely hope that eventually people don't get bored with it, because usually the tendency is that when you have long conflicts like this, initially everybody is helpful and excited and wants, but then people get tired, and then they start saying, well, you know what, gas prices are too high, and maybe we need to worry about the economy, we need to worry about our own things. And I'm worried that people will forget eventually about what's going on in Ukraine, or at least it's going to go sort of downhill in terms of enthusiasm and support. And that's, I think, is the Putin's calculations. He wants to prolong it, make it long lasting, and hope that eventually it will die down in terms of support, and then he's gonna achieve what he wanted. But anyway, let's hope it's not gonna happen. So
Right.
Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for taking time. I know it's semester is over and it's Friday,
Well,
so
it was a pleasure to hear you talk about it and to exchange ideas with you too.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And Gary, thank you for coming out of your retirement now officially, right? So that's good. That's good. All right.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Dmytro.
Thank you all.
Hope your family is safe then. Thank you.
Bye.
Dmytro, this was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah.
I'll stop.